Good morning and welcome to Economic Searchlight on Splash 105.5 FM, the integrity station. My name is Seun Akinola. Agriculture is the mainstay of Nigeria's economy, employing approximately two-thirds of the country's total labor force and contributing about 40% to Nigeria's GDP. Undoubtedly, Nigeria is the world's largest producer of cassava, yam and cowpea. Yet, it is a food deficit nation, and the country depends largely on imports of grains, livestock products, and even fish. Of an estimated 71 million hectares of cultivable lands, only half is currently used for farming. We certainly have a similar potential for expansion of irrigation, which now only covers 7% of irrigable land. Now, if we are so blessed as a nation, why is it difficult for us to feed ourselves? Why are we battling with food insecurity in the land of plenty? Why do we still depend largely on the smallholder farmers for our supply? Where is agribusiness initiative of the previous administration? How can agriculture provide healing for our ailing economy? Once again, welcome to Economic Searchlight on Splash 105.5 FM, the integrity station. Nigeria is never in short supply of grim statistics. Today as we speak, we are complacently sliding down to about 98 from 92 out of the same countries ranked in the Global Hunger Index. The simple reason for this is because we are unable to feed our people. We're experiencing food insecurity. Former French President Charles de Gaulle once said, "A nation that cannot feed itself is not a great nation." And the former US President George W. Bush said, "When people talk about agriculture, they are really talking about national security, because a nation's ability to feed itself is a decisive factor for its power." You see, it's of utmost importance for us as a nation to build structures that will sustain agriculture, grow our food, and feed our own people. Can you imagine a country that was unable to grow enough food to feed the people? It will be a nation that will be subject to international pressure, a nation at great risk. A nation that cannot feed itself is no better than a nation that cannot defend itself, so says Professor John Eckert. Today on Economic Searchlight, we're looking at food insecurity in Nigeria. According to experts, food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food which meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. According to experts, food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food which meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. The inability of a people to have access to food makes them insecure. Professor Francis Idachaba, a renowned professor of agricultural economics, said Nigeria, as blessed as it is with abundant agroecological resources and diversity, has become one of the largest food importers in sub-Saharan Africa. With an annual population growth rate of 2.8% without commensurate rise in food production, Nigeria is on the brink of food crisis if nothing is done to shore up our food production. In the National Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science and Technology recently, in its report, tagged Nigeria a food-deficient country. And you may ask, can we by any stroke of luck or persistent strategic planning and execution change this trend? I had a chat with the immediate past president of International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, Kanayo Nwanze. We examined the causes of food insecurity, farming, plight of smallholder farmers, and the economic implications of neglecting them. You see, IFAD over the years is dedicated to eradicating rural poverty in developing countries. Today, 75% of the world's poorest people, about 1.4 billion women, children and men, live in our rural areas and depend on agriculture and related activities for their livelihoods. My guest on this part of the program is a former president, International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, Kanayo Nwanze, a Nigerian national who had a strong record as an advocate and a leader with a keen understanding of complex development issues, particularly in agriculture and development. Kanayo Nwanze, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
We'd like to talk about food security in Africa and also how we can galvanize the interests of young people in agriculture. I know that you have an advocacy sense with efforts to ensure that agriculture is a central part of international development agenda. What spurred your interest in that?
Well, thank you indeed. My career professionally, I am an agricultural scientist. I spent my first 20 years doing agricultural research on various crops in Africa, starting, of course, here in Ibadan as a postdoctoral fellow, then on to Congo, RDC, DRC in English, in the late 70s, working on cassava as a cassava entomologist. Then back to West Africa, Burkina Faso, Niger, the Sahel region, working on coarse grains, sorghum and millet, before I spent another 10 years in India. So in essence, agriculture is my raison d'etre and doing research for the benefit of small producers in developing countries, particularly in Africa at that time. But I will admit that my real exposure to smallholder agriculture was when I joined IFAD in 2007 as vice president, and then of course president as from 2009 until March of this year, 2017. It gave me the opportunity to travel extensively all over the world to meet small producers. And as I spent more time with small producers in rural areas of the developing world, I saw the huge potential that these poor rural people have, not only in feeding themselves, but also in feeding the world. But also, there's a paradox in all of this, you see. When we talk about zero hunger, when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals 1 and 2 on hunger and on poverty and hunger. Now, the question that arises in one's mind is, where really in the world does poverty and hunger run deepest? It's in the developing world. And where do they live? They live in rural areas. What is their major source of livelihood? It's agriculture. What kind of agriculture? Smallholder agriculture, small holdings, whether it's crops, less than 2 hectares, sometimes a quarter of a hectare, whether it's fishing, they have small boats, whether it is livestock, they have maybe 1 cow and maybe 1 goat, 1 sheep. So you see, now what is even more, in my mind, ridiculous is that these rural populations whose livelihoods depend on agriculture are the ones who produce the majority of the food that is consumed in the developing world.
And that's always on their own effort.
And yet, investment in rural areas is not a primary consideration by governments. We always think about urban populations, urban infrastructure, and what have you. You go to any remote village in our country, Nigeria, and you will see that they have no electricity. They have no pipe-borne water, so they have no energy. They have practically no roads, maybe a few dirt roads, and if they're lucky, they have a clinic 5 kilometers away, and no banking system. So I became really passionate about this irony against humanity, by humanity. And that's when I decided that I would be the voice of the poor in rural areas around the world, and particularly in Africa. Because I have lived it, I have seen it, and I see how they are not considered a major part of our society, yet they feed us. The other paradox is that they are the ones who are most hit when there is a problem. When there's a drought, they lose their crops. When there's a flood, they lose their crops. You see what I'm saying? And we don't invest in them. When there's a bumper crop, the prices crash. They can't sell their produce. When there's a drought, they cannot harvest much. So this is why I took upon myself that I must advocate for them, because if we are to eliminate poverty and hunger in the world, it has to start in rural areas. As long as one rural child dies of hunger or dies with malnutrition-related diseases, our job is not yet done.
Now, do you think Africa is looking the way of the smallholder farmers?
That is the sad part of it. There's a lot of rhetoric. Let me give you an example. African governments decided, put their signatures to it in 2003 in what is described as the Maputo Declaration. That declaration, they all put their signature to ensuring there was an allocation of 10% of their budgets to agriculture. Less than 8 African countries, 54 of them, have regularly fulfilled that obligation. Now, tell me if we are serious about a declaration. And that is why I keep saying that declarations and meetings and commitments don't feed hungry people. The other irony that really baffles me is that our continent, just like Nigeria indeed, is the richest continent in the world. When I mean riches, natural resources, mineral resources, and people, and excellent weather for growing crops, from north to south, from east to west, even in the driest parts of Africa, they have crops they can grow. Water resources, plenty of rainfalls, plenty of sunshine. Why is Africa not able to feed itself with all of these natural endowments that it has? The answer is very simple. For me, it is very simple. Poor leadership, bad governance, blatant corruption, mindlessness towards poor people. That's it. Mismanagement. How else can you explain it?
So would you say that Africa should be able to feed itself?
Africa should be able to feed itself and not even ask for assistance from outside. You know, I'm not being that pessimistic. These are realities. You know, when you look at our continent, Africa, and you see how Africa was emerging from the mid-50s into the 60s and early 70s, Africa was seen as the hope for the future. Africa was seen as the next continent to lead the developing world. That was a period when, if you remember, in Nigeria, we had pyramids of groundnuts, of cocoa. We had timber floating in the ocean and the seas to be cured. We had rubber. We grew our own rice in Abakaliki and all, you name it. Cocoa, oil palm plantations across West Africa. Tea and coffee from East Africa, rubber, Liberia. So these were the periods when many African countries, including Nigeria, invested no less than 20 to 40% of their resources into agriculture. Let's take the example of our country. It crashed. Investment in agriculture crashed when we discovered oil in the 70s. At the time when agriculture was contributing close to 70% to our gross national GDP. 70%. It dropped to below 10% at one time. We neglected it. Well, thank goodness we learned our lessons. We depended on oil, of course. We thought oil was... But how many people has oil fed in Nigeria? It's fed a few pockets and left the majority of our populations poor. It resulted in crisis in the southeast and in the northeast by populations that were neglected. You see, frankly speaking, it is Poor, wrong policies, bad governance. If our leaders had maintained, acquired the vision and the commitment as the leaders of a first republic, this was a time, I'm telling you, this was at the time in the 60s and 70s when no African country, as far as I remember, was a net importer of food. This was a time when China had a very bad famine and 1 million Chinese died from famine. This was a time when Brazil was dependent on food aid. This was a time when Vietnam came out of war and could not feed itself. South Korea came out of war, and African governments provided support, financial and human, to South Korea. India was described as a hopeless case. By the turn of the century, all of these countries were providing aid to Africa.
So why did we get it wrong?
Greed for power and for wealth at the expense of their populations. When our leaders should invest in their people, serve their people, the reverse occurred.
The program is Economic Searchlight on Splash 105.5 FM. I am still having a chat with the immediate past president of International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, Kanayo Nwanze. We'll take a break now, and when we come back, I'll continue my chat with Dr. Kanayo Nwanze. Do stay with us. Welcome back. The program is still Economic Searchlight on Splash 105.5 FM, the Integrity Station, and I'm Seun Akinola. Dr. Nwanze is still on the program as we engage on the contribution of agriculture to the nation's economy. As we speak today, agriculture still remains the single highest employer of labor in Nigeria, most especially in the rural areas. It employs about 40% of the population, and this figure is steadily on the increase due to the current unemployment rate. A lot of young people are picking up agriculture as an alternative after leaving school. After oil, agriculture still remains the second highest foreign exchange earner for the country. Cocoa is the highest foreign exchange earner, with Nigeria producing more than 200,000 tons of cocoa per annum. But you may want to ask, what do we gain from this production? How about tapping into its value chain? Why is it that we do not have a chocolate producing company in Nigeria? This output can be greatly increased if the current traditional methods of cultivation are traded for more modern mechanized methods. Kanayo Nwanze further gave more perspectives on these issues. I'd like you to look at the productivity in your state here. We have about 11 research institutes in agriculture within this enclave. When you talk about productivity, what an hectare of land of cassava will give us in Nigeria isn't the same thing that it will give them in Asia. In some part of Asia, you can have 14,000 tons. In Nigeria, maybe you have 4,000 to 5,000 tons of cassava from the same hectares of land. How have we gained from these institutes?
Well, it's not as simple as, just the institutes, and we have host of viable technologies, whether it's crop varieties or improved farming systems and what have you. But these institutes, to what extent are they supported financially and politically by our governments, both federal and state? Research for research is not going to feed anybody. Research must get to the field, to the end user. But take the IITA, for example. We see what IITA is doing. IITA has grown consistently over the last 6 years thanks to the extremely well-performing leadership of Dr. Sanginga. He has moved the institution from just doing research for research to doing research for development. Training young farmers, showing them that agriculture is an economic activity that generates money like any other business. That when you look at the whole value chain, from putting the seed in the soil or milking the cow to the end product that gets to the market, there is a money-making process there. Exactly, and it's a profession, a very dignified profession. But it's not rhetoric, because these young people are out there doing it and seeing that it is profitable. So, in essence, what I'm saying is this. It's not just as simple as saying, well, we have to make agriculture attractive for the young people. It's what do we mean by that? What are the elements of that? It's not just, we should stop, just talking in rhetorics. We need to put our money where our mouth is. And I have seen it happen. See, I always say to people, we know what to do. Because we know what works and we know what does not work. And we know where they work and where they do not work. So let's not reinvent the wheel. What we're talking about is no magic bullet. It is common sense. But common sense applied in a strategic way that is able to boost the livelihoods of people in rural areas. I repeat, if rural people remain poor and destitute and do not have the basic amenities that you and I enjoy in Ibadan or in Lagos or in other capitals of Nigeria or other state capitals, we will still have poverty and hunger. And when hunger persists, people become desperate.
Okay, I still want to talk about development of agriculture. That's what they call official development assistance, to round it off.
Yeah.
Trump administration said it's cutting it by half. How will that impact on agriculture in Africa?
I beg to differ with you on one issue. I know no country in the world that developed itself through official development assistance from external donors. I want you to get this very clear. Each of the countries I gave you examples of, India, China, Brazil, Vietnam, Cambodia, and so on, they invested in their own development. Development is not something that comes from outside. It's an intrinsic process. It must begin from inside. Change begins only from inside, not from outside. We should stop being dependent on official development assistance. And what is even more ridiculous is that the developing world generates more than $7 trillion in internal resources. What is overseas development assistance today? What is it? $135 billion? Compare that to 7 trillions. So, all of this talk about overseas development, it's a shame that we should be dependent. It makes you nothing but a bonded slave to foreign assistance, because you cannot determine what you want to do. You have to respect the orders from outside. Overseas development assistance is a pittance compared to internally generated resources that we have in Africa. Our problem is because of greed, theft, poor governance, political corruption, and what have you. We are not able to manage our resources. Listen, do you know how much money we lose in Africa as a result of illicit financial outflows? It's in the billions every year. I'm sorry, maybe it's just as well that Trump is cutting down its contribution. The U.S. is cutting down its contribution to ODA. Perhaps it will make our leaders wake up to realize what resources we have. If you know what we have in terms of mineral deposits in Africa, cobalt, diamond, gold, I can give you, if I had my statistics, I can give you the percentages. Mostly African countries, oil and gas. They're all exploited. And that is part of the over $3 trillion worth of resources and investment that leave Africa, compared to less than 1.5 that comes into it. Africa continues to be the basket for other countries, particularly the West, because we do not know how to manage our resources. We have enough resources in Nigeria and most of Africa to invest in our own development. If our leaders will only be able to accept the fact that we have failed in the last 50 years.
Indulge me in this. Africa or Nigeria is still trying to export its produce in raw forms. Do you think that is right?
Of course it isn't right. It isn't. How much does a farmer get? Dr. Akin Adeshina will be able to give you the figures. The average cocoa farmer perhaps gets not even up to $1 per kilo of the cocoa that they sell, compared to the value of cocoa in the international market. Not to talk about its finished product. If Ghana, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and Cameroon would come together and establish a cocoa commodity market in West Africa and determine when to sell and when not to sell, you will see the change in the cocoa market in favor of our producers. It is about time. Do you realize that, apart from maybe Ghana, that we do not have any country that has a viable chocolate factory? Yet we produce, I don't remember, 60 to 70% of all the cocoa in the world market. Why should we be exporting? Take our country, Nigeria. Why should we be exporting crude oil? Why should we? How many refineries did we build since 1970? How many of them are functioning today?
And now we're exporting yams.
Raw yams. No value addition. Listen, it is disgusting when you think about all of this. It is frustrating to the point where I don't understand why we do not see how we make fools of ourselves in this nation and other parts of Africa. We have so much wealth, and yet we're playing with nothing but sand and calling it gold.
Do you see hope?
Losing hope. What is the legacy we're leaving for our children and grandchildren?
Kanayo Nwanze, thank you for speaking with Splash FM.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
It is a common saying that the quality of food consumed by a people is a stark revelation of the quality of life of the people. With a population of more than 180 million and growing, Nigeria needs to produce enough food to cater for her growing population and also export to earn foreign exchange along its value chain. And that's it on the program for this week. Do join us next week for another edition. For comments and suggestions, you can contact me via email sakinola@splashfm1055.com, sakinola@splashfm1055.com. My Twitter handle @Seun Akinola. For SMS 081 12494 231 081 12494 231. I'm Seun Akinola. Bye for now. Thank you for staying tuned to Economic Searchlight on Splash 105.5 FM. Our focus this week is on food security in Nigeria and its effect on the economy. Nigeria has seen the need to wean herself from crude oil, the black gold from the Niger Delta. The government must pay attention to agriculture to build a more resilient economy. We obviously cannot sustain a situation where we spend about $2 billion on rice importation annually. On the nation's 56th independence anniversary, President Muhammadu Buhari said Nigeria will be self-sufficient in the production of rice, millet, sorghum, maize, and soybean by 2019.
The Federal Ministry of Agriculture and the Central Bank have been mobilized to encourage local production of rice, maize, sorghum, millet, and soya beans. Our target is to achieve domestic self-sufficiency in these staples by 2018. Already, farmers in 13 out of the 36 states are receiving credit support through the Central Bank of Nigeria's Anchor Borrowers Program. Kebbi State alone this year is expected to produce 1 million tons of locally grown rice, thanks to a favorable harvest this year. As part of the 13 states, Lagos and Ogun are also starting this program. Rice alone, for example, costs Nigeria $2 billion United States dollars to import. The country should be self-sufficient in basic staples by 2019. Foreign exchange thus saved can go to industrial revival requirements for retooling, essential raw materials, and spare parts. It is in recognition of the need to reinvigorate agriculture in our rural communities that we are introducing the LIFE program.
The president equally said, in recognition of the need to reinvigorate agriculture in our rural communities, government was introducing a scheme called LIFE program to boost rural economy. It said the Federal Ministry of Water Resources and Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development will build lakes, dams and water harvesting schemes across the country. At least we can take government up on some of these promises. The president in that broadcast equally said government recognizes that irrigation is key to modern agriculture and it is determined to ensure that the nation no longer dependent on rain-fed agriculture for national food requirement. He also promised that they will revive the 12 river basin authorities across the country to commercialize them to support crop production, aquaculture and accelerated rural development. But how much of these laudable promises have the government been able to achieve? In my chat with Kanayo Nwanze, I asked him why we have not been able to galvanize sufficient interest in agriculture to revitalize our economy. He alluded the bane of our problems to inconsistent policies, lack of agricultural inputs and infrastructure. Kanayo Nwanze. Agriculture is said to be the most important sector of the African economy. Do you agree with that fact?
I do agree with that fact.
It is one factor that could drive us out of poverty. You also alluded to that issue. It's said to have accounted for 65% of the continent's employment and 75% of its domestic trade. If these statistics are true, why are we finding it difficult to galvanize interest in agriculture and use it, as a base to develop our economy in Africa?
Because we have enacted the wrong policies. I mean, there's no rule of law. There's greed. Money that should be invested into African agriculture is used to import food. $35 billion annually, the cost of importation of food to Africa, projected to rise to 100 billion by 2030. Just think about that. We are giving our money away to countries outside of our continent, North America, South America, Asia, to grow food that we pay for, food that we can grow in Africa. We create jobs for other people when we have the largest proportion of unemployed youth on our continent. And we put money in other people's pockets, money that should be invested in our agricultural systems for infrastructure and the rest of them. Bad policies. What I'm saying is not magic, because if you look at the developed world and the emerging economies that I just cited to you, you will see that each of these countries had to pass through the gateway of agricultural transformation for their economies to grow. Britain in the 18th century, China of the 20th century, Brazil of yesterday. We are importing rice from Thailand. When did Thailand begin growing rice? When did they become commercial? Because they're organized. 60% of all the rice that is grown in Thailand is grown by small farmers of less than 2 hectares. But they are organized. They are supported by government. They have consistent policies that do not shift from one day to the other. And so farmers have access to markets. Our farmers don't have access to markets. They're not organized. They don't have roads even to transport their food, their produce. Agriculture not only feeds people. Farming does not just feed people. Farming is the largest sector, the sector that produces the largest number of jobs in any nation, at least in the developing world. It generates wealth. It puts money in people's pocket, and it creates a cohesive society. And stability of any nation depends on how cohesive the society is. And that starts from rural areas. The majority of our populations live in rural areas. How can we neglect them?
I'm concerned about the economy aspect too. You say we've neglected them. Look at it this way. Value-added agriculture as a percentage of GDP for Africa remains very, very low.
Well, I tell you, see, if you go back just a few years ago, a couple of years ago, just wind back to when Minister Akinola was Minister for Agriculture. Look at what he did in 4 years. Take the fertilizer story in Nigeria. The Ministry of Agriculture was known as the Ministry of Fertilizer. He changed all of that in 90 days, less than 3 months. He changed all of that and put the fertilizer importation and distribution out of the ministry, and farmers began to have access to fertilizer. He scrapped all of that corrupt practices. He put in policies. Census of farmers were made, farmers were recorded, the e-wallet system came into place, access to microfinance was made possible because he negotiated with the central bank. He knew what it was. He is a visionary. And in 4 years, he already began to transform the agricultural sector. His successor, Minister Audu Ogbe, is doing the same. But I hope that we remain consistent to be able to achieve what Akinola has started. The point here is, let's come back a little bit home, because to talk in this way, people say, well, it's possible, it's just talking. Let's look at the African continent, where we have successful cases where countries are actually making tremendous advances. You know, of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world, 4 to 6 of them are supposed to be African countries. But don't forget, GDP growth is not equivalent to social development until that growth is reflected in the improvement of the lives and livelihoods of the populations that live in rural areas. Let's look at the case of Rwanda and the case of Ethiopia. They are good examples of countries that have been able to move their people, their populations, and the country a little bit out of poverty. Highly productive agriculturally, sound policies, good macroeconomic policies, investment in rural areas, organization of farmers, groups and associations, and as much as possible cooperatives, rural infrastructure, access to financial services, access to markets, and investment in the whole value chain, so that when farmers produce, they are assured that their produce will get to markets. These two countries I just mentioned, Ethiopia and Rwanda, do not have any significant resources from their mineral extraction. None. They depend on agriculture. And today, Ethiopia, one of the few countries that has a commodity exchange market that is working very well, the largest producer of honey in Africa, the second largest horticultural industry, the largest number of livestock herds, the largest exporter of leather, with many local companies run by Ethiopians. Take the case of Rwanda. Rwanda is given as an example of the fourth revolution, IT, and the advancement of IT in Rwanda, almost becoming like a hub in the continent. So what makes these two countries distinct? Leadership and continuity in policies. It can be done. It can be done. These are agricultural economies, Rwanda and Ethiopia. They are agriculture-dependent economies. Brazil of today, agriculture was what transformed Brazil. China. If a country is not able to feed its people, it cannot move into the 21st century.
And Nigeria is not able to feed its people.
But look at how much money we're spending importing food, our country itself. The four key commodities: rice, sugar, wheat flour, and to some extent milk. The three, wheat, sugar, and rice, we spend no less than $4 to $6 billion importing these commodities every year. We can grow enough rice in Nigeria. The problem is the quality and the market.
You just listened to Kanayo Nwanze saying GDP growth is not equivalent to social development. Rwanda and Ethiopia are now examples for Nigeria. These two countries, he said, depend on agriculture, and they are referred to agriculture economies. Is it not possible for Nigeria to equally become agriculture economy? In fact, the Minister for Finance said we are not an oil economy. Isn't it wisdom for us to go back to the land. You're listening to Economic Searchlight on Splash 105.5 FM. We'll be back in a moment. It is a common saying that the quality of food consumed by people is a stark revelation of the quality of life of the people. With a population of more than 180 million and growing, Nigeria needs to produce enough food to cater for her growing population and also export to earn foreign exchange along its value chain. And that's it on the program for this week. Do join us next week for another edition. For comments and suggestions, you can contact me via email sakinola@splashfm1055.com, sakinola@splashfm1055.com. My Twitter handle @Seun Akinola. For SMS 081 12494 231 081 12494 231. I'm Seun Akinola. Bye for now.